Since the time Crow created the world, our people lived in the Yukon Valley, immersed in its beauty, surviving on its resources. The Yukon River provided us with the necessities of life. We traveled and traded along the waterway according to our own laws and life ways. It was not an easy life, and there were many challenges for everyone who lived it. The river represented life, renewal, and freedom. It has always been a large and important part of our spirituality. In long ago people times, or Kwade Kwadan, in our Southern Shoshone language, only First Nation people lived in the Yukon Valley. The land along the river has been our ancestral home for thousands of years. We lived a nomadic lifestyle, dependent on our natural resources for survival. The Great Yukon River was our primary travel route and provided us the means for a diverse trade network with other groups of First Nation people. During the late 1700s, our ancestors started trading for European goods with Tlingit people from coastal Alaska. Although First Nation people in northern Yukon met Euro-Canadian explorers in 1790, our ancestors were not to see white people for another 80 years. With the arrival of Westerners, many things changed for our people. There was much we did not understand. In order to survive, we had to be strong and adapt to the many new ways of the newcomers. This is another short, however important chapter of our history. It is our story of living in the time of great change.
Although Europeans had not yet entered southern Yukon, their diseases did. The Yukon River, the pathway for trade, became a course for spreading contagious infections for which the Yukon people had no natural immunities. Trade with infected Tlingit from the south and Shoshone from the north triggered the spread of several epidemics through the southern Yukon during the early 1800s. Our people suffered grievous losses. It took 100 years for our people to develop immunities to these diseases. Beginning in the early 1870s, prospectors began to trickle into the southern Yukon in search of gold, thought to be hidden in the Yukon Valley. Although Yukon First people had always known of gold, they had never developed a use for it. Nevertheless, it was Native people who on August 16th of 1896 discovered the Klondike riches. On that fateful day, Skookum Jim Mason, Dawson Charlie, Kate Carmack, and her non-native husband George Carmack found a substantial amount of placer gold on a small tributary of the Klondike River. What happened in Yukon next became known as the Klondike Gold Rush. Over 30,000 stampeders arriving at Skagway, Alaska, hiked over the White and Chilkoot passes to the headwaters of the Yukon River. Once on the waterway, they built boats and began the 550-mile journey downstream to Dawson City and the goldfields. Despite the initial difficulties of adjusting to the sheer numbers of newcomers, Aboriginal people from Alaska to the Klondike played key roles in these events. The Stampeders introduced foreign ideas and new technology, as well as their own police force. With them came many unusual goods and supplies, carried and pulled by an array of animals never before seen at Kwanlin. The newcomers did bring something our adaptable people could understand and take advantage of: a cash economy. Our people survived, and in many cases thrived, in the newfound industrial market.
A sprawling community of ambitious entrepreneurs quickly overran the fishing camps in the Kwanlin area. Our people's packing service along the canyon portage was quickly replaced by the newcomers' tramways of horse-drawn carts. Our ancestors moved downstream to fishing sites below the last set of rapids. Already famous for their waves resembling the flowing manes of white horses, the rapids were regarded by many as the head of navigation for the Yukon River. It was here businessmen were hastily constructing the infrastructure needed to service an increasing freight and transportation business. In 1898, our people witnessed the arrival and construction of steam-driven sternwheelers at the newly named city of Whitehorse. 2 years later, they were spectators to the first White Pass and Yukon route train, connecting the city to Skagway, Alaska. Our people's once peaceful fishing ground had transformed into the center of navigation for all freight and passengers en route to and from the goldfields and all stops in between. Without necessarily even knowing what was happening, our people were faced with sudden changes in their society, their culture, and their way of life. For the most part, the changes were instantaneous. Our trade with other First Nation groups had all but stopped. Our animal furs were now purchased by the newcomers in return for cotton clothing, metal tools, and items of all descriptions to make life easier. Many of our people were sustained by the viable trapping economy and faced little pressure to abandon their nomadic pursuits. Others, with strong family ties to the Kwanlin area, spent at least some of their year in camps near Whitehorse. Sternwheeler operations were dependent upon seasonal service industries, for which First Nation people were the ideal workforce. Many worked as deckhands, loading firewood and freight onto the boats. Others preferred to work in the wood camps, cutting fuel for the ship's boilers. Now armed with repeating rifles and cotton fishing nets, Some of our people made their living hunting and fishing. Meat and fish were in high demand by the new resident population and sternwheeler passengers. Salmon were needed to feed the ever-increasing population of working dogs. Many women living in Whitehorse kept busy making and selling traditional winter clothing. Others grew gardens as produce was easy to sell.
Our people looked on while Whitehorse and its population grew. What enthusiasm our people had for this progress was diminished by the cumulative effects of disease and the increasing competition for fish and wildlife resources. To make matters worse, the newcomers were receiving scores of land allocations from their government in areas traditionally used by our people. It was during this time our people came to realize they were confronting a political force which organized all the newcomers under rules of which our people had little comprehension and even less influence. The spiritual void our people were slipping into became filled with those offering salvation and choices proposed by others who appeared to know what should be done and how to do it. By 1902, our people living along the river, north and south of Whitehorse, united in their appeal to the Government of Canada. Chief Jim Boss, leader of the Ta'an, wrote to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. He demanded the overhunting by newcomers be controlled and the people be compensated for lost land and the impacts on wildlife. The response Boss received was the police would protect his people and their land. As it had in other parts of Canada, the march of colonial enterprise through Yukon had little regard for the culture, language, and traditions of First People. In the South, land treaties with Aboriginal people were hastily negotiated in order to clear the way for settlement. In regards to Yukon, the government had no desire for setting aside land for native use, a resolution based on two conflicting ideas. First, the arm of government dealing with Indian affairs was uncertain the territory could sustain permanent development. They suggested Indians should be best left as Indians, sustaining themselves through the harvest of wildlife. On the other hand, the government's economic arm saw the Yukon serving as a resource base for the rest of the country and was not about to consider exclusive native access to land and wildlife.
In less than 50 years, our people went from life in Quedan times to living under the rules of the Government of Canada. With our best interest in mind, and as they did in the rest of Canada, the government proclaimed our people wards of the state. We became people without rights or self-governing powers. We were segregated from the white community and the economic benefits of industry. We were removed from the responsibilities for the care and education of our children. Over time, the government set aside land where we were told to live. They called the land Indian reserves. Our people now faced a new challenge, greater than any of the past. They were not only trying to maintain our culture, they were trying to preserve what was left of it.
When the gold rush was over, many stampeders left the Yukon. Others stayed in the Whitehorse area and began to live a more settled life. Many of our people were trapping, as it was one of the few ways to make a living. Fur farming became popular in the Whitehorse area, and a number of our people made a good living, trapping and selling live fox. Living on reserve land, no matter how well one did, was not a promise of permanence. At various points in time, industrial expansion along the river demanded access to lands granted to our people. The government's response was to arrange a hasty transfer of the reserve, a course of action repeated many times until the creation of Lot 226, known as Indian Reserve Number 8. Beginning in 1921, many displaced First People were relocated to this place situated in a low-lying floodplain on the northern edge of the city, next to the sewage outfall.
As our people adapted to the changes brought by Western culture, they held fast to the threads tying them to our forebears and our traditional ways of life. Although we rarely reaped advantage from the development going on around us, we lived along our river as best we could. Our belief in sharing and looking after one another helped our people through the most difficult times. Through all this, we have maintained our traditions, our humor, and most importantly, our pride. We remained people of the river.